Man is the measure of all things, said Protagoras. Not everyone shared this opinion, even in ancient Greece, but it does represent a way of thinking which permeates Greek culture. From the beginning, Greek art is man-dominated to a greater degree than the art of any other civilization, and we can trace its development almost exclusively by looking at changes in the rendering of the human form. And that is how we shall be looking at Greek sculpture, particularly during the 5th and 4th centuries BC. This was the time of the fullest development of the Greek city-state, the classical age of Greece and of Greek art. This is a statue from the end of our period, or perhaps a little beyond, the late 4th century, the figure of a boy nearly life-size. The subject is uncertain. He may be pouring wine into a cup held in his left palm, but we can't be sure because the objects are lost. The statue was found in the sea off the Attic coast near Marathon, and it's in bronze. It is in many ways a typical classical statue with the elegance and freshness of an original from the circle of Phidias. The artist had aimed to make the figure look natural, lifelike, but the natural forms are simplified and the action carefully adapted to an aesthetically harmonious design. The original concept of a statue in Greece was very different. These two larger-than-life-size youths in marble, known as Cleobis and Biton, were dedicated to Apollo at Delphi by the people of Argos about 600 BC. The type, which we know by the Greek word kouros, or youth, was constant in Greek sculpture from its beginning until the end of the Archaic Age, just before the Persian Wars. A naked youth, stepping forward with one foot, but otherwise symmetrically designed about a vertical axis, arms at the sides, no twist, turn, or bend. The kouros is the typical central type of archaic statue, though there are modifications and other types of male figure, as well as corresponding forms of draped female figure. The form derives from a much earlier Egyptian model, but there the weight is on the rear foot and the figure normally wears a skirt. Egyptian artists weren't much interested in anatomy, and the type remains virtually unchanged for hundreds of years. The anatomy of these early Greek figures is shown in a very schematic way, but from the start it is clearly something which interests the artist, and in two ways. First in itself as a rendering of natural form, and secondly as a means of giving the statue a clear, formal, aesthetic pattern. This concern to produce a statue which will both give an impression of truth to nature and be an effective formal structure is central to the history of Greek sculpture. Here's one of the later kouroi, inscribed with the name Aristodicus. It must date very near 500 BC, about a century later than the Delphi twins. The basic composition is unchanged, but the forms are now much more like nature. Notice how the arms are joined to the thighs by struts. The artist, pursuing a natural effect, wanted to carve the arms free, not clinging to the sides as in earlier work, but was afraid they would break off. His followers were bolder, but it's clear why bronze, which has a much greater tensile strength than marble, became the favourite material in the succeeding early classical period. Aristodicus shows the furthest point Greek sculptors could reach while remaining content with the old kouros type, the traditional structure for a statue. But if Greek artists were to develop, not settle like Egyptian artists into the repetition of accepted formulae, they had to make some profounder change. So it was that early in the 5th century, what we think of as the classical revolution took place. This life-size marble figure of a boy was dedicated on the Acropolis about 480. The differences between this figure and a kouros are very slight but profoundly significant. The weight is on one leg, the other relaxed, so that hips and shoulders are no longer in parallel planes, and there's a very slight turn and bend to the head. The effect of the changes is perhaps more noticeable in the back than in the front view. A whole new world has been opened up to the sculptor in varieties of pose and in the contrast of taut and relaxed muscles. The Critian boy is a classical statue, not a kouros. This lovely head, called the fair-haired boy, from the colour which has faded since it was found, is from a similar statue. The carving of the neck shows that the bend of the head was more pronounced than in the Critian boy. There's a human quality, and the features display another more inward aspect of the change, the seriousness, the gravity of the new art. From now on, there is a continuous change and development in the treatment of the human figure, throughout the 5th and 4th centuries into the Hellenistic age. Within a few years of the classical revolution, Greek art had reached one of its great culminating moments in the sculptures of the Parthenon. The frieze is thought to reflect the style of Phidias, the outstanding artist of his time. Unfortunately, none of his freestanding statues have survived, so for the next stage in the development of the male figure, we have to look to Polykleitos, the other great sculptor of the period. His work has come down to us, but only in copies of varying quality. This is the most complete of many Roman marbles which reproduce his best-known work, the Doryphoros, the spear-bearer. The tree-trunk support is a typical telltale addition of the copyist. The freeing of the statue from the kouros pose has gone much further than in the Critian boy. There's a rhythmical character to the statue, a balanced contrast of straight and bent, of taut and relaxed limbs. And the rhythm is carried through into the structure of the torso. The lines defining the breast, belly and hips are given a quite unnatural clarity and heaviness, far more so than in the late Kouroi or the very early classical Critian boy. This was perhaps because after sculptors had abandoned the archaic formality of pose, they felt the need to emphasize the formal pattern of the statue in some other way. By great good luck, we do have one superb original bronze of the early classical period, which was dredged up from the sea off the coast of Cape Artemision. It dates from the 460s. The powerful sense of form is combined with exquisite delicacy in the decorative but vivid handling of the hair and beard. The heavy braids bound round the head we met earlier in the fair-haired boy from the Acropolis, but by now it's an old fashion, probably confined to figures of gods and heroes. Mortal athletes wore their hair short. It must represent either Zeus or Poseidon, according to whether he was casting a thunderbolt or trident. It is not an original composition, but belongs to a tradition of small statuettes going back to archaic times. All the statues we have looked at so far have been of figures standing still. This is an action figure, and its main view is in profile rather than in full face. The difference lies not only in mastery of anatomical form, but in the balance of the powerful figure in motion. A little earlier than this, from the 70s, is the other great early classical bronze from Delphi, the famous and lovely charioteer. Apart from one arm, it is beautifully preserved. There's a silver key pattern on the headband and traces of copper inlay on the lips. The eyes, left hollow in the casting, are inset in coloured stone. The exquisite chiselling of the hair shows us how much we lose in even a good marble copy. This figure originally formed part of a group standing in a car drawn by 4 horses whose reins he held. He's wearing the long tunic of his profession. The deep vertical folds, almost architectural in their simplicity, conceal the bodily form beneath. They suggest the fluting of a column, but in no mechanical way. Cords at the back cross over to prevent the garment catching the wind during a race. But here the figure is still, and the whole group must have been quiet. The charioteer differs from all other figures we have looked at so far in one important aspect. He is clothed. There is a tradition of the clothed figure in Greek sculpture as old as the nude, but chiefly in figures of women. As a general rule, the male body is shown naked, even where nudity is not natural or appropriate to the action. Some of the horsemen on the Parthenon frieze, for instance. It's an artistic convention linked to the dominance in art of the human form over all other subjects. The convention, however, only applies to male figures. Alongside the earliest naked kuroi appear clothed female figures of extremely simple design. This, a larger-than-life-size dedication to Artemis, is one of the earliest Greek marbles we possess, and no doubt one of the earliest made, about the middle of the 7th century. A lovely small figure dedicated to Athena on the Acropolis a century or more later shows how this simplicity could be developed with great subtlety. The shape of the female body is emphasized by the simple, clinging dress known as a peplos. There's a real sense of a living form here. The quality of this archaic work is outstanding, but it is in fact a type as constant as the kouros and known as a kori or girl. During the 6th century, a new fashion and sculptural treatment of drapery was introduced. This little figure, also from the Acropolis, just before 500 BC, is typically late archaic. Prettiness and a fascination with elaborate drapery are the hallmarks of this style. And as we noticed in the male figure, there's also a new serenity, which is an important aspect of the coming change from archaic to classical. A large torso, again from the Acropolis, shows how the late archaic sculptor experimented with drapery, using it to reveal the body and giving it a life of its own when it hangs free. In contrast, early classical sculptors build on the armature of the body a severe design of almost architectural simplicity. This statue of a goddess is preserved in several marble copies. The treatment of the face and hair are so like those of the bronze god from the sea that the original must surely have been from the same school or hand, and also in bronze. As in the charioteer, the fluting of the skirt is emphasized like a column, though it looks rather mechanical compared with that marvelous work. Many small bronze statuettes have the same character, and a freshness which the copyist's marble lacks. Particularly beautiful is this one from Delphi, supporting an incense burner. The fluting of the skirt is looser and freer than in the previous figure, and is broken by one knee. The broken fluted skirt remains a favourite device right through to the classical era, modified in different ways by different generations of artists. From the late 5th century we have splendid examples in the caryatids of the Erechtheion. Because of their architectural function, the sculptor has made them stand with an almost archaic frontality. There seems a touch of deliberate archaism too in the braided hair and in the way the skirts are held to one side as one sees in the back view. One could hardly find a sharper contrast for the caryatids than the magnificent victory dedicated to Olympia and signed by the sculptor Paeonius. It's probably a few years earlier than the caryatids, but the difference in style has nothing to do with the difference of date. We see a return to the preoccupations of late archaic sculptors in a fascination with the play of drapery and its relation to the body, in places closely modelling the limbs, elsewhere flying free in a life all its own. The effect, however, is totally transformed by the profound understanding of the human body in movement. In early archaic art, swift movement was indicated by a kind of hieroglyph, the position of legs and arms approximating to a swastika. This figure, also of a winged victory, was supported free of the base by the drapery between the legs. By the end of the archaic period, a more natural movement had been mastered, as in this charming little girl from Eleusis. But with Paeonius's figure, we are in another world. The bird under her feet shows that she is in flight, but we don't need it to tell us that. The statue is actually supported by the mass of the blown-back skirt, a sophisticated development of the motif in the archaic statue. A cloak held in both hands flew out above, and that in turn was topped by the open wings. But despite the losses of these essential elements in the composition and the loss of the face, the combined effect of power and grace remains extraordinary. This new style seems foreshadowed in some of the sculptures of the Parthenon. Carved in the 40s and 30s of the 5th century in the circle of Phidias, the Parthenon pediments show better than any other kind of sculpture that has come down to us the culmination of the classical style. At the same time, they seem to hold the seeds of later styles like those of Paeonius. In these great goddesses from the east gable, we can see how the drapery is used to model the splendid forms beneath and also to build rich and satisfying patterns of its own. They are quiet figures. The daring movement of Paeonius's victory is more nearly approached but not reached in this figure of a young goddess, though her drapery is much simpler. Or there's the lovely ruin from the other gable, the winged iris. Both pediments also show magnificent male nudes. The large, simplified forms, the vivid transitions tell us as well as anything that survives what classical sculptors were trying to do with the human body. The new clinging drapery style evolved on the Parthenon and magnificently developed in the victory of Paeonius, allowed artists to model the female body as though naked while preserving the convention of a clothed statue. Having reached this point, they made another break, and completely naked female statues began to appear in the 4th century. This naked Aphrodite was the most popular statue in the Greco-Roman world. It was also the most famous work of the great 4th century sculptor Praxiteles. He adhered to convention as far as motivating the nudity, by suggesting that the goddess had been surprised bathing. Here the water pot and clothing are integral parts of the statue's original structure, not additions by a Roman copyist. The copies of this masterpiece are poor things, but they do show us that Praxiteles' creation of an ideal feminine nude was a much more radical departure from tradition than simply leaving off the clinging clothes and paying more attention to surface subtlety. Earlier statues of women tended to stand as foursquare and firm as their male counterparts, and their proportions were often similar. But in the Aphrodite, the sloping shoulders and broad hips are emphasized by the shrinking, stooping movement. The water pot and lifted garment serve both a practical and an aesthetic purpose as a support for the rather unstably posed statue. This was a truly new creation of a feminine ideal in sculpture to match the old masculine one. But it's hard to get much aesthetic pleasure from these copies. We can get a better notion of the quality of 4th century sculpture by looking at one of the great marble gravestones fashionable in Athens from the time of the Parthenon until the end of the century. This beautiful piece is late after the middle of the 4th century and displays something deliberately avoided by earlier artists, a new quality of tenderness. This gravestone, or stele, which is a little later than the previous one, shows also the new proportions which come in at this time. The limbs are longer. Heads become smaller. These changes are associated by ancient writers with the name of another great 4th century sculptor, Lysippus of Sicyon, who became court sculptor to Alexander the Great. Apart from stelae, Lysippus seems to have worked exclusively in bronze, and his most famous statue, the Epoxyomenos, is preserved in marble copies as poor as those of the Aphrodite, but, like them, informative. All the statues we have looked at so far have been designed for a single primary viewpoint. So also, perhaps, this. But the arm brought across the body, the other raised abruptly forward, break up the traditional harmony of contour and emphasize a new tendency to naturalism, present also in the momentary movement, the weight seeming to shift between the wide-set feet. Both these tendencies, to naturalism and to emphasizing the third dimension so that the statue seems to invite one to walk around it and look at it from other angles, are both fully developed in the following Hellenistic age. Many Hellenistic statues are cunningly designed for all-round views. The most exciting example to survive is the wonderful little bronze jockey made around 100 BC. Naturalism and many-sidedness grow easily out of the late classical style, but they are foreign to its highest manifestations in the 5th century. To see how far we have come from that time, we should glance back at the great bronze god found in the same wreck as the jockey, but made nearly 400 years earlier, and observe again the single dominant viewpoint and the grand idealization of form and feature. This is classical sculpture.